In Blender and 3D in general, drivers are a way of having an input drive the output of something else. For example, we can make the rotation of this monkey drive the location of a cube. Now that's a really simple example. However, it is possible to do some really fancy things with drivers. Here I'm creating a bouncing ball based on a mathematical expression and the current frame number. This function actually takes a few inputs, like the frame range, and it has a few custom properties, and they're all driving the output, which happens to be the height of the ball. Now don't worry, we won't be doing anything as silly or as complicated as this. In this lesson, we're going to keep it simple and just scratch the surface of what drivers can do, mainly because I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information, plus that information is not something that you need right now. So what is the most common use for drivers in rigging? Often we create a custom property on a bone and then use that to drive the influence on a constraint to turn it off like a switch. And that's what we're going to be doing in this lesson. Simple yet powerful. So what is a custom property, I hear you ask? That is a way of attaching your own data to anything inside Blender. Custom properties can be strings, that is a computer term for text. It can also be a Boolean, which is a true or false statement. It can be an integer, and that's a number that does not have a decimal point. It is a whole number. It could be a float, and that's a number that does have a decimal point. It can also be an array, which is a set of things. It could be a set of numbers, could be a set of booleans, or a combination of all those things I've mentioned. A custom property can also reference an existing data block that could be like a specific object in your scene. And finally, it can also be a single line Python expression. However, for this lesson, we're just going to focus on a float number that goes between 0 and 1. Now, all of this sounds pretty fancy and complicated, but really it isn't. Let me show you how easy it is. So let's get started and learn about drivers and custom properties. Okay, so here I am inside Blender and I've already got a little bit of a setup. Now, if these names don't make sense to you at the moment, don't worry. In the next chapter, the terms owner and target will make perfect sense. But here I want to add a constraint to this owner bone so that it targets this one here and also targets our second target. And then I want to add a custom property to turn those constraints on and off. Well, really, I want it to turn one on while it turns the other one off. So first up, I'm going to select the target and the owner and hit Shift-Control-C. And don't worry, you'll get really familiar with that shortcut in the next chapter, don't you worry. I'm going to choose Copy Location, and then you'll see our bones snap over there. You can also see that constraint here in the Constraints stack. And I'm just going to mute it to temporarily disable it. And that way I can add a second constraint really easily. So here's my target. I'm going to select that guy and then hit Control-Shift-C and choose Copy Location. Now you see I have two constraints, although if I turn this back on, you'll see it has no effect. And that is because this constraint is being overridden by our second constraint. So what I want to do in this lesson is actually add a custom property to our control to turn these ones on and off. We'll actually turn this one off while it turns this one on and vice versa. Now doing it this way is going to introduce a slight error, but I'm doing that on purpose to show you a little bit more about how things work under the hood. So let's actually add our custom property and then connect it to these influences. Now, if you've already had a poke around inside Blender, you'll notice that there's lots of different places where we can add a custom property. We have one on the object level, we have one on the data level, and then we actually technically have two on the bone level. We have one when we're in pose mode, and we also have one when we're in edit mode. So where do we actually put them when we're rigging? Well, I always like to have a little bit of think about what the purpose is before I add a custom property. And this is going to be something that the animator will need to turn on and off. So technically they would need to be animating this. And as we've already learned, pose mode is where we do our constraints and our animation. So a custom property like this, we would want to add it on the bone level under pose mode. So I'll just jump back into pose mode. And this is where we would want to add that. So under our bone tab down here, we've got custom properties. I'm going to click on new, and then it's created a new property called prop, and it goes from 0 to 1 by default. If I want to edit that, I'm going to click on this little cog here. We get this little pop-up dialog. Under the type here, you can see these are all the different types that I've spoken about in the introduction. I don't need to explain them all. We're just going to be focusing on a float at the moment. The property name, this is where we can give it a name. I'm going to call it my prop. The default value, this is its default setting. With our minimum and our maximum here, this is the hard setting. So it won't be able to go past 0 and 1. When you enable the soft limit here, you can actually set a soft minimum and a soft maximum, and that won't let the user go past this value when they interact with it in the input box, but they can click in that box and then type any number up to the hard limits. This is a handy feature, but it's not what we need in our situation, so we can just leave this one alone for now. The step is how much it will increase or decrease when you hit these little buttons here. You can raise this up or lower it. I think you can just leave it at the default. And the precision is how many decimal places it's going to calculate to. You can leave that at the default as well. We also won't need to change the subtype, but I will point out that there are different types of numbers in here. So say, for example, if you need to do something with angles, you can change that type of number so that when Blender does its calculations, it knows how to handle that number. But for us, we can just leave that at plain data. We have our description here, so we can type in any helpful description here. And then when you hover over the property, it will display that. I'll show you that in a moment. But finally, we have our library override. Now this is to do when we link in our rig into a different file for animation. That's something that we actually want to do. We don't want to create a copy of our rig for every file, because if you make an update, you'll have to make that update in every file. So the way around that is we link in our rigs into the animation files, and we create a library override to be able to animate it. So if we want the animator to be able to change this property, then we need to make sure that we enable this. If this isn't checked, when it gets linked into the new file, this property will be there, but they will not be able to change it at all. Okay, so now I can click OK here to confirm all that. And if I hover over my property here, you can see that helpful description. And this property is also up here in the item tab under properties, because I have that bone selected, the owner bone. And if I hover over here, you can see that property. Now, if I drag this, you can see that these are connected. All right, so we've added our custom property. Now I just want to connect that property to these constraints. So one turns on while the other one turns off. Okay, so I'm going to split my view so we can bring up a driver's window. I'm just going to right click, choose vertical, and then change this one over to be the driver's editor. So now I can see all my information over here, but nothing's in there. So I'm going to add a driver on our influence down here. I'm going to right click and then choose add driver, or the shortcut is Control D, and then you'll see it pop up here. And I'm going to reset my view by hitting home, and that gives me a better view. Just reorganize things so we can see everything. And then when I click on this driver here, all the information to do with that driver is here in the drivers tab. So by default, it added a scripted expression for us. And you can see that expression here. It is var plus 1.0. Now this 1.0 is the default behavior of Blender. It's going to add whatever the value was when you clicked that button. This is a little bit annoying in my opinion, but I'm going to deal with that in a moment. This var, the VAR, is what is in this variable down here. We can add variables if we like, or delete them, but these names have to match. So this var here is the same as up here. Now that just went red then because it tried to first evaluate that driver and the information isn't filled out. So it's like, hey, something is wrong. This expression is broken. And you can tell that from the red line under our driver up here as well. So before I fix that, I want to show you the different types. When we click in here, we've got many different types of drivers. The scripted expression will give us this little expression box that we can type in here if we like. The maximum will choose the maximum out of all of our variables. I only have one at the moment. The minimum will choose the minimum value. The sum will add up all of those variables that we've added, and then the average will average out all of those variables. But in our example, we're going to leave it on scripted expression, but we're going to fix our expression now. First off, we do not need that plus 1.0. We can just remove that. We need to finish setting up our information in here. This little drop down here will let us change the type of variable this is. By default, it's chosen the transform channel. A transform channel is, say, if we wanted to connect the X location of a certain control to a driver, that's what we would choose. However, in our example, we added a custom property, and the custom property is under this single property, and it looks like the DNA little symbol here. There are some different ones, but we'll be going through those in a later course. Right now, we're just going to choose a single property. And then we need to tell it where to find that property. So first we're going to choose the object, which happens to be called armature. And then we need to tell it the path. Now, what is the path? That is the internal path to this specific spot in the object. Thankfully, we can right click on here and then choose copy data path and then hover over here and paste it with Control V. And that has pasted our path here. I'll just make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see that. So the path is pose.bones owner my prop, which is a little bit much to remember. So thankfully we can right click for that. But now we've added that, you'll notice that all of our red has gone away. So technically, when we move this, you'll see some stuff start to happen. First of all, you'll see our bone move from one side to the other, and this is linked. Our influence happens to be linked here. So let's just explain what this curve means. This is a linear mapping, a one-to-one mapping, I like to call it. The horizontal is mapped to the input, and the vertical is mapped to the output. You can see these little dotted lines here. This is the input value. And over here, it's going to map it to the output. At the moment, this is a one-to-one mapping, so the output is going to be exactly the same as the input, but it doesn't have to be the case. We can actually adjust the handles to change that mapping, or even control click in here to add extra points. And whatever this curve looks like, it's going to map the value of the input to the value of the output. Now, please don't do this with your mapping because I've seriously broken some stuff, but this was how you set up a driver and one way that you can change that mapping. But I think you will agree that that was quite a few steps. So in the next part of the lesson, I will show you the quick way of setting this up. Plus, I'll show you how to connect this same property that we created to the other constraint. So our custom property turns one constraint off as it turns the other one on. So rather than doing all of those steps manually, thankfully, we can right click on our property here and copy all that information as a new driver. So I'm going to click on this one here, and that has copied all that information into Blender's buffer, and then I can just paste it wherever I like. I'm going to right click in here and say paste driver. Wasn't that much quicker? We don't have to mess with these things, although you notice it has used an average value rather than our scripted expression, and for us that is perfectly fine. It's going to average out a property of 1, which is just going to give you this exact property, and that works for us. So now, how do I actually get this same driver up here but flip it so that it turns off while the other one turns on? Well, at the moment, I still have that same driver copied into the buffer. So the first thing I'm going to do is paste that same driver in. So I'm going to right click and say paste driver. And then you'll see that is the second one on our list. But I want to reverse the mapping. So when our input is a value of 0, the output is going to be a value of 1 and vice versa. So I could actually change my values here if I wanted to. I can set them to be reversed, but there's actually a quicker way of doing it, and that is to use an F-curve modifier. So over here on the modifiers tab, I can click add modifier and then choose generator. And by default, nothing has changed, but it has removed our keyframes. And that is because we can control this curve with our polynomial up here. Now, what is a polynomial? You probably remember from maths class, y equals mx plus c. That is our value here. So this is our coefficient. We want to flip it so that it is -1. So I'm just going to type -1 here. Now you'll notice that the slope of the curve is going in the opposite direction, and that's what we want. Although we need to shift this whole curve up so that when the input is 0, the output is 1. So in here, we can just type a 1 in there, and that's going to shift our whole curve up. So if I turn them both back on now, you see our curves are looking like an X. Okay, so let's check this out. When I turn 1 on, you'll notice that 1 is turning off. This is awesome. This is exactly what I wanted. Although here is the error. You'll see that it's dipping down as it's going from one to the other, and that is because it's trying to get back to its default starting position, which would be down here. Plus you also notice when it's in the middle, it's not actually in the middle of these two targets. I'll explain why that is in a later tutorial. But for our case, we don't actually want this first influence to be driven. We only want this second one to turn on and off, and this one to stay constant. So I actually don't need the driver here. So I'm going to delete it. So let's just go right click, delete driver, and then I'll need to reset my value there. But hopefully you can see now, when I take my driver from 0 to 1, it's traveling in a straight line between those two targets. And that's what I wanted. And when we're at 0.5, it is directly in the middle. And now you're probably wondering, why did I go to all that effort just to delete all my work? Well, the main point was actually to show you how to flip the curve with the modifier. And that's something that you do need to know how to do. We just don't need to do it in this specific setup. And I also hope you got to understand a little bit more about how the constraint stack actually works. Sometimes we don't actually need to turn one of our constraints off because of the order in which we place them. And we turned on and off this second constraint that was overriding the first. I do hope this all makes sense, and please go and have a little play and a practice with this now, but we will be doing something very similar to this as a little challenge later in the course. But that is all for drivers and custom properties at the moment. I will see you in the next lesson.